Good evening and welcome back to Introduction to Composition and Research. Tonight we're going to do two things. First, I want to, as you can see on the board behind me, I want to go over some detail about documenting in the various formats that we have talked about through the course of this class. And then we'll go back and try to highlight some points that we covered at the beginning of the semester, just sort of a refresher about some of those things as you're beginning to compile information and write your research papers here at the end of the semester. And that way, next week, which is our last week, we can spend our time in reviewing for the final exam. So all of the information that I'm presenting about these various formats comes from the documentation that you should have, PDF files that were sent to you from the OWL, the Online Writing Laboratory at Purdue University. And they pertain to these three documenting formats: the Chicago Manual of Style, which you'll sometimes hear me call Turabian, the Modern Language Association formatting, and the American Psychological Association formatting. Now, as I've mentioned before, Turabian comes largely out of the journalistic world originally, newspapers and journalism, and then into the colleges and universities. Modern Language Association is primarily an educational sector product from colleges and universities. And this is the methodology used primarily in the scientific and the literary departments in universities and colleges. APA, the American Psychological Association, is the formatting style that is typically used in social sciences departments. And so you can see that there would be a little bit of different emphasis between these three. Now, Chicago Manual of Style uses what's called a notes and bibliography, or an NB system of citation. And this refers to both footnotes and endnotes, the type of information that you put in those, and the bibliography, hence notes and bibliography. In the Chicago Manual of Style format, when you create a reference, a citation, whether it's a quotation or a paraphrase of something that an author wrote, or simply a reference to something that an author wrote, or any other source for that matter, be it a video or something online or notes taken in a class or something. When you create a reference to that, the first time you reference it, now bear in mind, all of your sources in Chicago Manual of Style will be included in the bibliography, which is at the end of your research paper. And in the bibliography, all of your sources should be fully documented: author's last name, then first name, title, and so forth, just in exactly as we've talked about before. But when it comes to in-text citations, that is, in the course of your writing, when you quote something or when you reference something, doing that, you would then, after the quotation or after the citation, the reference, the paraphrase, whatever it is, you would put a superscript number, and that would be a little number, number one, above the line. And then at the bottom of the page, there's normally a line across the page. And at the bottom of the page, you would put that little number one, and you would put your documentation information. There is a minor difference, and the handout from the OWL makes note of this. There's a minor difference between Turabian's, Kate Turabian's style and the Chicago Manual of Style. Turabian always uses a superscript number in this reference, and CMS uses a full text number, which comme ci, comme ça. No big difference there. I don't care, frankly, if you use Turabian or CMS. I use Turabian without thinking about it. However, when you cite something, when you quote something, when you have something in your text as you're writing that you need to document. The first time you reference it in your text, in that first footnote, or if you're using end notes, which would come at the end of the chapter or at the end of the paper before the bibliography, that first reference incorporates complete information, total information. Author's last name, first name. If there's more than one author, each author's last name, first name, in order that they appear, the title, the city of publication, the publisher, the title, the edition, if need be, of the work, and the year it was published, and the page number. If you come back to that reference again, a second time, or a third, or a 25th time, and you make mention of it again, every subsequent reference to that source, that first source, every subsequent reference for your footnote or your endnote, you simply put the author's last name and the page number. That's all it takes. So once you've put the information in completely the first time, every time after that that you refer to that particular work, that particular reference, all it takes is the author's last name and page number. Now, in the event that you have two different sources by two different authors who have the same last name, then you would modify that by adding the author's first initial or first name, as well as the last name. So instead of Miller, page 25, it might be A. Miller or B. Miller to distinguish which Miller you're talking about. When you have multiple citations from the same source on the same page of your writing, your first one, the first reference, just like always, complete information. The second one, you could say author's name and page number. But if the very next reference is from this source, then all you'd have to put in italics is the Latin word capitalized I, B-I-D, ibid, period, comma, and the page number. That's true whether it's the second reference on the same page as this first one, or whether it's a second reference on some other page after this subsequent reference. Ibid is the abbreviation for the Latin word ibidem, I-B-I-D-E-M, which simply means in the same place or from the same source. So you don't even have to put the author's name in that case. You just say in the same place on this page, here's what was found here. Now, in the notes and bibliography system of documenting things, the bibliography comes at the end of the paper, and it gives an alphabetical list of every source that you use, every source that's used in that work. Now, you may have a stack of books or references or a stack of note cards for information that you did not end up using at all. You may have examined 30 sources and found that only 7 of them were actually useful and had pertinent information. You only reference those 7 sources that you actually used. You don't reference every book that you looked at or every source that you looked at. You reference those, you put in your bibliography those that you actually used in your writing. Now, bibliographic entries may be formatted differently depending on what the source is. A published book, pretty simple, straightforward, a single author, author's last name first, first name, and then the title, the publication information, and all the pertinent data. Now, in the CMS Turabian format, all of those pieces of information are separated by a period. So you would put the author's name, Smith, comma, John, period. The ABCs of mechanical work, period. And then you would give the publisher and the city of publication, sometimes reversed, depending on which format you're using, and all the rest of the pertinent information there. The period is the dividing symbol for this format. CMS is, in the minds of most students, it's the most labor-intensive format. In reality, and I have used all three formats over the course of almost 50 years now. In reality, it's no more intensive than any of these others. It just puts the primary effort up front instead of at the end. So let's talk about the Modern Language Association format for just a moment. Some of this is probably repetitious. Modern language, MLA, uses what's called a parenthetical system of citation. And in all of these, the red letters, the notes and bibliography system, the parenthetical system, or the author date system, what's written in red refers to how you document something in the text of your writing. We're not talking about the end of it, we're talking about in the text references. So with the Modern Language Association format, you have what's called a parenthetical system. And the parenthetical system places the relevant source information in parentheses immediately after a quote or after a paragraph or after the paraphrase of that information. And what you put in the parentheses is simply the author's last name and the page number in the work where it's found. Or if it's an electronic source, then the fact that it's at such and such a source. You also might put, if it's a web page or something on a DVD or an electronic database, you would put print or web or DVD, something of that sort. And then in the bibliography or the works cited page at the end, you give more detail, more information about that. You wouldn't put the web address here, you would put web. And then you would give the address where it was retrieved in the works cited. Any source that you use, that you provide in-text information about, should correspond to what's in the works cited page. This is not hard. I find it tedious, but it's not difficult. MLA gives you a variety of ways, and in the PDF that you should have, those are listed, a variety of ways of citing this information, author page. Now, the two primary ones that you will use are these two formats. If you are writing and you quote or paraphrase something that Henry Wordsworth said about romantic literature, you might be writing along and you'd say, Wordsworth said thus and so about romantic literature. And so you've used the author's name in the text of your writing. You've said who it is. So you don't need to put Wordsworth's name in the parentheses. When you get to the end of what he said or what you're summarizing, you would simply put the page number in parentheses in that sentence. Wordsworth said that romantic literature is a crock, page 263. Wordsworth didn't actually say that. He was a hopelessly romantic writer. However, you might not use the author's name in the text that you are writing. You might be summarizing what was the opinion of 36 different writers. And you might say, for example, one author wrote that romantic literature is a crock. And then you would put in parentheses Wordsworth, 263. That tells us which author said that. Those are the two most common ways of citing your sources in MLA. Now, as I said, if it comes from the web, if it comes from a magazine article, if it comes from a newspaper article, if it comes from an electronic database, there are some nuances there that alter that slightly. That's all here in the PDF that you've got. If you use Microsoft Word, if you use Pages, if you still use WordPerfect, you can set up your boundaries in your document so that you can put those sources in and it will document them for you. Whenever you refer to them, it will create that citation. Or you can have it, you can do it yourself, and it will pull from that little database of sources that you have put into that particular document. There are some distinctions to make. Sometimes you'll quote something or you'll reference something that is not by an individual author, but by a multitude of authors. Sometimes you'll use something that you know is from an earlier edition or a later edition of the same work. For example, in my library, I have a set of the Expositor's Commentary, which is a fairly common multi-volume set of commentaries, but it has been republished, reprinted 3 or 4 times in the last 150 years. And mine is not the most recent edition. So I would need to say that it's the 3rd edition or the 1956 edition or what have you, in order to distinguish that it's not the most recent and it's not the original, because the page numbers are not identical from edition to edition. Another example might be a commentary by Albert Barnes, a well-known older Presbyterian commentator. Barnes' Notes, the most common edition of Barnes' Notes, is a large assortment of individual volumes. But Barnes' Notes have also been published as a 7-volume set, large books with many volumes in the same binding. And so you would need to distinguish which edition you're using if you know that there's more than one edition. Sometimes the author is not, the author's name is not given, for example. It might be a corporate publication, something published by a company, in which case you would just use the name of the corporation or the company that published it. If you have no known author and no known publisher, for example, you would use the title, a shortened version of the title. If the title is 26 words long, you'd pick out the 3 or 4 key words to put in your citation. Now, in your works cited, you'll have all the detailed information. For the in-text citation, you always, always, always include the page number if it has a page number. Now, if you're quoting or citing from an online source of a book and you're looking at the PDF of it, you don't need to include the page numbers. You would put web or database or something of that sort, because the page numbers online, again, don't always, the document doesn't always paginate online, even the same from computer to computer. It depending on what app or program you're reading it in, what browser you're reading it in, it may paginate and give you different page numbers. So unless you happen to see the page number on the scan of the printed document, then you can't tell what page number it is, and it's not going to be accurate from browser to browser. So you would say web or something of that sort in order to indicate that. Now, there are some parameters in MLA for multiple authors. If you have 3 or fewer authors, for example, I have some commentaries in my library by Conybeare and Howson, 2 authors. In that case, you would list both authors' last names, Conybeare and Howson. You could use an ampersand, Conybeare and the and symbol, or you could put Conybeare, Howson and the page number. If there are more than 3 authors, that's fairly unusual in most religious sources, but Bauer, Arndt, Gingrich, and Danker, BDAG, Standard Reference Greek English Lexicon, for that, you would use the first author's last name. So that would be Bauer, and then you would put a comma and add the Latin words et al, et space al period. Like ibidem, that's a Latin expression that means and others. It tells the reader there's more than one author here. And of course, in your works cited, you would put Bauer and Arndt and Gingrich and Danker in the works cited. So they have a complete listing there. MLA gives some specific instructions with regard to the Bible when you cite the Bible. MLA is also, to me, that very irritating format that puts scripture references in not in footnotes, but in endnotes rather than in text. But when you cite the Bible in MLA, you tell which Bible you're citing. So if it were the King James Version, you would put in your parentheses, King James Version, that part in italics or underlined, not both, one or the other, but not both. And then, not in italics, but in normal type, you would put book, chapter, and verse. And you have an example in the formatting here, for example, New Jerusalem Bible, Ezekiel, abbreviated EZEK, 1, 5 through 10. One distinction that MLA makes is that in citing scriptures, let me put this over here on the board. I don't know if you'll be able to see it clearly or not, but in MLA format, in citing scriptures, you give the book of the Bible, and it's usually a 4-letter abbreviation, and then you give the chapter. Most of us grew up learning to separate chapters and verses with colons, 1 dot over another dot, and then the verses 5 through 10. In MLA, and you will see this if you read, for example, Christianity Today and things like that. In MLA, the chapter and the verse are separated by a period rather than a colon. I don't know why. Personally, I find it rather annoying. That's just me. So you would, in citing the Bible, you would say King James Version, American Standard Version, New International Version, English Standard, whatever it is. If it is a particular edition, for example, Harper Study Bible, Revised Standard Version, you would say Harper Study Bible, comma, Revised Standard Version, or you probably could get away with RSV and then give the chapter, book, chapter, and verse. If it is a MacArthur Study Bible, You might want to note that it's the MacArthur Study Bible, English Standard Version, or New King James Version, or what have you, in order to distinguish which one it is. Of course, in your works cited, you would give all the publication information that pertains to that Bible, except don't list it under the author's last name as God. Don't list it in the works cited as Christ, comma, Jesus. Don't do it. And if you're a smart aleck, don't do it as Spirit, Holy, Thee. No. It's a given. We know who the author of the Bible is. Now, for electronic sources in MLA, if you look at page 10 of the handout, it gives some information there. You include the first item that in text sources, you would include the first item in the works cited entry, whether it's the author's name or the article name, the name of the website, whatever it is. And again, like I said, you don't have to worry about paragraph numbers or page numbers because every web browser paginates things differently. All right, let's talk about the American Psychological Association format for just a moment. I had to use this when I was a student at Victoria College some years ago, and it was a new format to me in those days. APA, where Turabian uses notes and bibliography system, and MLA uses a parenthetical system that is dependent primarily on author's name and page number. APA is similar to MLA, but not identical. It uses an author date system. And in the APA format of citing information in the text, the information, the reference key is the author's last name followed by the year of publication. Author's last name and year of publication. Now, like MLA, there are two basic ways you can do this in text with APA. You can use the author's name in your writing, in your text. Jones says that using the APA format is absurd and tedious. Well, you would say Jones, and then you would put the year that he said that, the year that he wrote that, what it was in, the book where he said that. Jones, 1998, says that the APA format is absurd and ridiculous. Or you could say this particular researcher found that the APA format was tedious and tiresome to use. Jones, comma, 1998. And that would be the information in your parentheses. Author date versus author page, really. But in MLA, it's not always author page. Sometimes it's author source. So those are the general fundamentals of such things. An author date system in the APA goes back to that works cited page. That's one thing that MLA and APA have in common. Now, let me emphasize this. Not that I will expect you to use the APA format. I do not, and I do not expect you to, but you may need to know this. You may write a manuscript for a lectureship book or something, and that's the format the editor will want you to use. You may go on to Faulkner University or Freed-Hardeman or Harding University or somewhere, and they may want you to use it there. APA has a series of rules about author names in this system. They break it down. If you have two authors, Coney Barrenhausen, use both names and put the word and, not the symbol, but the word and between the names. If you have 3 to 5 authors, you list them all and put the word and between the names, and then use the ampersand, the and symbol in the parentheses. Use and in the text. So you would say Jones and Smith if you're writing it in the text, but you would say Jones and the ampersand, the and symbol, and Smith and Williams and Freud, if you put it in the parentheses. After that, for a subsequent citation, you would just use the first author's name and the expression et al. APA even goes so far as to tell you how to use 6 or more authors. APA does specify if you don't know who the author is, if it's an unknown author, then you would use the title and the year rather than the author. And APA also gives some specific information about citing online sources, online book sources. And the main distinction in online book sources is that if the particular source, the reference, is not directly available online, or you have to purchase it, then you would say available from and give the online address, the web address, the URL, Universal Resource Locator. If it is readily available online, you can pull up a PDF of it and read it, then you would say retrieved from and give the URL. And some publishers would also want you to give the date when it was retrieved, because those things do change. APA also gives specific instruction about Kindle books. So if you buy textbooks in electronic format as Kindle books, and there are a lot of Brotherhood titles and others that are now becoming available as Kindle books, but if you reference them in APA format for a Kindle book, you have to give the DIO, the Digital Object Identifier number, and it'll be in the Kindle documentation book of the book. That's used in place of the publisher information. That's enough of all the gory details of formatting for now. So let's go back and just sort of refresh our memories a little bit. Correctly spoken English, not painfully pedantic, but just correctly spoken English enhances a preacher's ability to communicate the gospel effectively, clearly, and efficiently. Correctly written English does the same thing. Poor grammar is a distraction because it's muddy. Poor grammar, when written, leaves the reader wondering, what exactly is this writer trying to say? Being accurate in your expression, expressing yourself accurately, clearly, is the key to the reader understanding what you're trying to say, what you're trying to communicate. Go back to Ephesians chapter 3, read verses 1 through 4, and Paul made exactly that point when he talks about explaining or revealing the mystery of Christ, the mystery of salvation in Christ. Proper grammar, correct grammar. We're not talking about being painful, but being clear. Proper grammar simplifies your style and it clarifies what you're trying to say. When we talk about preaching and writing as preachers, as Bible teachers, as students of the Word, there are different vocabularies that we all use. We use our common everyday vocabulary. The man walks into the house after a hard day at work and sees his wife and says, "Hey, sweetie, how you been?" Well, that's not proper grammar. How you been? That leaves out some words, doesn't it? How have you been? But we understand it. It's clear. The inflection and the informal reference, sweetie. Well, her name might be Gertrude, but sweetie's a term of endearment. It's slang between the two of them, but it's not standard. Nobody else except maybe her father or her grandchildren copying daddy, granddaddy. Nobody else is liable to call her sweetie unless she goes into a meat and three cafe somewhere in the deep south. And then the waitress will call her sweetie or honey or something like that, because all of them do here. When we talk about vocabulary in academic writing, you want to use general vocabulary, normal words, not slang words, not jargon. Now, in some fields and some academic fields, in the sciences, for example, there is an unavoidable use of some jargon, scientific jargon, for example, phrases and expressions that are unique to that field. But for preaching, for teaching, as a Bible student, you would use a normal or general vocabulary, not informal words, not overly formal words, just call it standard language. There are a lot of very common mistakes in the average 21st century writer's writing. Probably the most common grammatical error is disagreement between the subject and the verb in number. They, has, he, have. Disagreement. They is plural, has is singular. He is singular, have normally is plural in that context, in that construction. Sometimes it's a disagreement in number between a compound noun. Joe and Tim has. No, Joe and Tim are plural, so Joe and Tim have. Next to that would be a disagreement in time and tense in the verbs. A present tense verb connected to a past tense verb. Capitalization errors. Proper names, proper nouns, names of places are capitalized. Other words are not normally, except at the beginning of a sentence. In standard or general writing, we don't use numerals except in, for example, scripture references or page numbers or things of that sort in the text of what we write. We use the words. You would write SIX, six, not the numeral 6. Apostrophes are normally used only to show possession or contraction. They're not necessary to show plurality. Pronoun and noun disagreements are common. And I think maybe the most common mistake that I see reading students' papers are sentence fragments. Pieces of sentences presented as a whole sentence. That means they're missing a verb, or they're missing a noun, or they clearly should have an object, and yet it's not there. It's not a complete sentence. Basic sentence structure consists of the subject, which identifies who or what is doing something, and the predicate, which gives specific information about what the subject is doing. In other words, the subject is the noun, the who or the what. The predicate is the verb, the action that who or what is doing. Compound sentences are formed by taking two simple sentences and joining them together. Dogs run and rabbits hop. Rabbits hop and horses gallop. Dogs run, that's one sentence. Rabbits hop, that's another sentence. You can join those two together into a compound sentence with a conjunction, and that can be and or but, or even a piece of punctuation like a semicolon. Complex sentences do basically the same thing. They join two or more simple sentences, clauses, but they're not equal. They're not comparable. This one is the point, and this one supports it or contrasts to it. Dogs bark loudly. Some dogs live on the hill. Dogs that bark loudly live on the hill. You take two and put them together into one. Now, let's go back to formatting for just a moment, not the details of the citation, but why do we have to do this? And what should it look like? The reason that you write a manuscript, a research paper, is to learn how to collect, to collect, evaluate, digest, and then synthesize information on a particular subject to present it back to your instructor. You learn to organize it and present it in an orderly way so that it makes sense. And part of this process, the composition part of this class, is learning how to move a reader from an idea, premise, a thesis, through what you have learned, that's the evidence, to a conclusion. You don't want to plagiarize. You don't want to steal somebody else's work. That's wrong. You want to show what you learned. Now, when it comes to formatting, all three formats, and SBL, the Society of Biblical Literature, which we've really not talked about, it's not commonly used, all of them have the same basic appearance. You print on one side of the page, standard 8.5 by 11 paper, not legal, not ledger sized, not poster sized. 8.5 by 11, one side, white paper, double spaced except indented quotations that are single spaced, 1-inch margins, top, sides, and bottom, unless it's going to be bound. And for this class, that's neither here nor there. You footnote every direct quotation, or you cite it in these formats, you reference it. You cite every indirect reference, a paraphrase, or a general amalgamation of the information, unless it's just common knowledge. For quotations, keep them brief. If you're quoting from the Bible, 2 to 5 verses maximum under normal circumstances. Now, if you're going to do an expository study of a chapter of the Bible, Ezekiel chapter 18, for example, you could quote the entire chapter as part of the introduction to your paper. Or alternatively, you could break it down either by paragraphs or by verses, quoting them piecemeal throughout the text of the paper and then explaining the pertinent sections in that way. But ordinarily, when you draw in a scripture reference, or when you draw in a quotation from an academic source or a commentator or something, a brief paragraph, 3 to 5 sentences, is about all that you want to quote. Use some kind of a lead in. Give that quotation some sort of context. Don't just put it there. Don't just state it out of the blue. You're writing your thoughts, you're explaining what is in your mind, and then out of the blue, here's a quotation with no context. That will get you marked off because it needs context. Now, let's talk about the purpose of writing. Organizing and categorizing your information. This is familiar, should be to you. You need to know your topic. You need to show what you've learned about it. You need to explain what the reader should learn about this. And then you draw a conclusion. But remember, I can't emphasize this enough. The object, the purpose of research, including biblical research, is to gather relevant information about your topic, to identify the significant facts, and then summarize what you've learned about that particular topic into an identifiable, usable message. It's not about seeing how far out you can go. It's not about seeing how far out of the mainstream you can push. It's not about seeing if you can make this passage or this subject say something that nobody else has ever said before. The purpose of research is not gathering up trivia. It's demonstrating what you've learned. That means you're not trying to persuade, when you're doing research, you're not trying to persuade your reader. You're trying to show what you understand, what you've learned. The information for a research paper or a manuscript is organized to carry the reader from the initial idea or the initial question through everything that you have learned about it, so that they see, oh, I get it. This is how this writer came to this conclusion. That makes sense. All right. Now, I know that all of this is somewhat repetitious. We'll come back next week and actually do a review for the final exam. But I want to give you two other sort of refresher thoughts. The hardest part about writing for the average student is figuring out what you want to say. If you don't ever get to the point before you get to the end of your paper, then you've never explained what you learned. What are you trying to say? Before you start writing the paper, try to write down on a single page what your subject is, the 3 or 4 main things that you learned about it, and what conclusion you drew from it. Outline your paper before you write it. Then start with the body of it, the thesis sentence or the topic sentence, and the body and the conclusion. Then you can write the introduction. Writing well means you plan what you write, and you read over it, and you reword or rewrite awkward parts of it, and you clarify parts that are muddy. It's not hard to do. It may be hard to learn, but it's not hard to do. Think of the fish. Every fish has a head, a body, and a tail. Every research paper has a subject, its substance, and its summary. The subject introduces The substance undergirds, provides the foundation, and the summary explains where all of this goes. That's what research writing, what composition and research is all about. All of this stuff is merely, dare I say, window dressing. You can have a research paper that visually looks flawless, perfect margins, clear typeface, perfect spacing, everything exactly in order, everything cited exactly correctly. And if there's no information in it, if what you've written doesn't carry the reader from the idea through what you've learned to a rational, logical conclusion, even if it's a wrong conclusion, then you've wasted your paper and your time. If you reach a wrong conclusion, that can be corrected. The more you learn, the more you recognize, oh, this doesn't really follow. But in writing a research paper, that pathway through the information should be clear. Before you hand in a research paper, get a fellow student or a family member or another teacher or someone just to glance over it. They don't have to read through it word for word and check every source and every bit of documentation. Just get them to skim over it and then tell you what it's about. And if they can tell you what it's about and they tell you basically what's in your mind, good. You've accomplished your basic purpose. But if they get halfway through it and they look at you with a quizzical expression and say, well, what's this all about? That tells you, I need to go back and clarify what's here, because it's obvious that this is not clear to my reader. That's our class for tonight. I'll give you back most of an hour. Thank you for being here. We'll review next week and you'll get the final exam then. Good night, everybody.